Welcome to Seeking the Sacred Self. I'm your host, Naomi Rozak. Today I want to talk about choice and why for me this is a complex topic, and I've had a bit of an internal struggle whenever I've heard people talk about this idea that we all have an ability to choose. Often these are experts like psychologists, PhDs, and when they talk about the actions or behaviors of adults, they say something like, we all have choice. We are all responsible to make the right choice. If we're harming others, we're responsible for our harm and we all get to choose a different path. And then they use this to compare people who commit crimes and behave what society judges as badly to people who don't make that choice, even when they're born into similar circumstances. So, two people born into poverty and with fairly similar structures and dysfunction and difficulty, why would it be that one person goes one way and one goes a different way? Oh, it's choice, they say. Who knows why, but we all have choice. This idea doesn't really work for me. And I'll tell you why by talking about my own difficult behaviors, ones that people would judge. So, when I was a new mom, up to the first 3 or 4 years, I was really struggling. There's no other way to put it. I think there was a lot going on. To paint the circumstances, I had my first child when I was 24, and the second was born 21 months later when I was 26. So I had two very little children in a short span of time. Before I even knew myself, I was figuring out who I was and not doing a very good job of it at that. I had limited tools for parenting. I had been raised to punish children into what we call first time obedience, which is using switching or spanking to force immediate obedience from your child at any time. That means the first time you ask them to do something, they immediately yield and do it. I'd been taught that parents are supposed to control their children, to make their children into a good end product. So I bought into that. And then in my parenting, I was also largely unsupported. I had some babysitting help from my mom and some church friends once in a while, but I also had a husband who worked all kinds of hours and then studied and preached on weekends much of the time. So I mostly had to keep everything going on my own. For the first little bit with my first baby, we had only one vehicle between the two adults, and I had no driver's license. So I didn't get out of the house much. And then you add in that both of my babies were born in the fall, one at the beginning of September and one at the end of November, heading into the darkest, coldest season here in freezing Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And winter has always been something that has affected my mood. And then, of course, on top of it, there's a natural part of parenting babies and toddlers. There's so little sleep, so much noise and sensory overload, so much to do all the time, and so much goes undone. And on top of that, I was carrying a lot of unhealed trauma, unmet needs. And the way we pour into our children when they're born means I was meeting all of their needs, but all of mine were going unmet. Literally, all of them. And what happened was rage, anger, just pouring out of me. And I hated this about me. I hated it with a passion. I would keep it all together. I would be like the perfect parent, and I do everything so well all day, every day for 3 or 4 days. I would feed my children good food. I would love them and doctor them and soothe them to sleep and meet all their little needs and hugs and kisses and songs and playtime and taking them to the park and to the grocery store in the stroller. We would have little treats and snuggles. But every time they cried and needed me, it was just like nails on a chalkboard to me. And then maybe by the third day or the fourth day at bedtime, one more thing would go wrong. A child would fall off a stair step and start screaming, or would innocently do something I didn't want them to do, like splashing water out of the bathtub or playing in the toilet water or start crying when I told them to stop an activity. And I would just lose it. And sometimes this was just a bit of yelling or almost like lecturing, but it's more like a bunch of words were coming out of my mouth about how the kids needed to do or be this or that and not do the bad thing again, but I just couldn't stop it. And sometimes it was so much worse. It was this visceral rage erupting way down from my gut and coming up through the center of me out into like a scream to the point where it actually like vocally split my voice sometimes. I felt it do something in my vocal cords from the strength of the rage that was coming out. There were definitely times I grabbed my baby's arms and clenched my teeth and was so close to shaking them. Later, when my daughter was a toddler, my firstborn, I remember picking up a cup of water and pouring it over her head because there was one more argument about who should get the pink cup or the green cup, and I just needed them to drink the freaking water, you know? And there were more incidences like this. Thankfully, I can't remember them all. I just remember the general feel of this thing happening and how hard it was to know that I came very close to physically harming my children, and was definitely doing emotional harm. And the worst part of that was the shame because I knew I was doing the wrong thing. I knew I was parenting badly. I knew this was not who I wanted to be, and I was trying so damn hard to not be that kind of person. I would also look at the other things I was doing, like the fact that I had just done 3 or 4 days where I was a great parent and I was caring and I was present and I was involved, and then wonder why, this one little piece of losing my temper seemed to carry so much more weight than the whole 3 days I'd put in of the good parenting. And I couldn't really figure out, am I a good parent or am I a bad parent? Like, obviously a bad parent because I did the bad thing. But I knew I wasn't a bad parent because I was also doing the good thing. And it really just was such a hard time of life. And then after the rage incidents, the kid would look up at me with their big innocent eyes like, "What did I do wrong, mama?" Or they'd be upset, but they weren't sure if they could come to me to be soothed because I was the scary, angry thing waving my arms and yelling at them, right? To this day, I regret how I was in that time. Although it doesn't have the heaviness anymore, I wish I could go back and give myself a hug and gently point me in the right direction of, some good healing and some good parenting resources, and also tell her she's not alone, that most parents have these moments unless they've had the privilege of doing a lot of healing and learning before having kids. And even then, most parents, all parents, probably still come close. I've since talked with a lot of moms. Just about everyone I've had this depth of conversation with has told me about moments they had or still have that they regret. They lose it at the end of many days of being practically saints with their children. And I and they are so ashamed because we know this isn't good for our children, but we didn't or don't know how to not do that, how to keep it from happening, how to improve for the next time, even when we're trying hard. So that's what I want to talk about. In those moments when the rage was bubbling up inside me, I could not stop. If it was a day where I'd actually had almost enough sleep and the kids weren't having a really struggling kind of day, often I could cope when things were going wrong. My regulation was better. My ability to feel feelings but not lose it because of them. It's like the capacity I had to bounce back from stuff was bigger. But on the raw days, when there'd been too many days of exhaustion and work and being unseen and unsupported, and the needs were too big from the kids, there was no help and there was no way to stop. And I really feel so much compassion for people whose behaviors are more violent or more difficult or more harmful or more judged than mine were, because I know what it's like to want to do better or feel like this isn't even you, but not be able to stop. So I want to ask you, how much choice did I have there? Once that rage was triggered, there was no time to think. There was no mental filter. There was no time or ability to choose my actions. The rage just came flying out. That shame I dealt with, that feeling of being good or bad, sometimes I was so scared that somebody would call Child Protective Services on me. You know, a neighbor who would hear the kids screaming or hear me screaming. Sometimes I even like this scares me to talk about even like it brings up the fear of those moments that sometimes I would yell and then I would check the windows to be like, did anybody hear me? Because I was scared. I knew my actions weren't good. And honestly, sometimes all it was yelling. But I still knew inside of me, this is not good. And another part of me would protest because, again, I knew I was a good parent. I loved my kids. I was trying so hard, and still, some of my behavior with them bordered on physically violent and certainly was emotionally violent. I also want to present here this idea of fear that somebody who is genuinely struggling and would love to ask for help but doesn't know to ask for help is so afraid of being punished by like having children taken away from them or having judgment from society or something that they often can't even ask for help in the way that they need. And I didn't know at the time that there were any resources that could have helped me. In fact, years later, I found out that there were like anger management classes that parents could take in our neighborhood. Like they were part of the public health program. And I was like, I should have taken one of those years ago, right? So, yeah, we just need to know also what it's like to feel such shame and such fear of punishment, but also be like, wait a minute, I'm not terrible. Like, I do all these other good things. I just lose control once in a while. And how that can keep somebody bound. And what especially keeps us bound is just the fact that we can't talk about it, right? And I wonder what that fear is like for people who have more extreme behaviors and who genuinely don't like what they see in themselves, but have no way to ask for help from a place or person who could actually do something to help them because of the shame or the fear of punishment. And let's just let that idea hang in the air a little bit. Before I go further here, I do want to say that my kids are teenagers now, and even from the time they were much younger, I've talked over that time with them and how I used to react to them, and I'm very open both about my regret and about what I was going through at the time, while at the same time not putting my parenting emotions on them. I carry what belongs to me and I give them space to talk about any memories that come up for them, and I'll continue to do that, knowing that as they get older and process more things, they might have some vulnerable parts of them that carry fear and need healing in the future. And I'll continue to hold space for their needs and their processing. I share my story because it illustrates in a small way that there are things we have choice about, and there are places we go inside of ourselves where the ability to choose is gone. And so, one of the things that affects our ability to choose is our regulation. In those parenting days, sometimes I could choose my reaction, sometimes I couldn't. If my awareness was good in that moment, I could feel a reaction starting to come and I could choose to walk away from my kids or stop angry words from coming out of my mouth. And other times I couldn't. The emotion was there and too big before the awareness of it was there. So there's a concept called regulation, and what it means, especially emotionally, is do we have the time and the energy, or in other words, the capacity to match what the current moment is asking of us? So if we're at a children's birthday party and kids are running around screaming, we are regulated if we feel okay to handle the running around and the screaming, or if we're running around and screaming ourselves and we feel good about it, if everything's fine, right? But okay, go back to my situation. I have little kids who have these needs, and what they're asking for from me is bigger than what I can give them. Then I become dysregulated. I am not regulated in that moment because I am not able to give what the moment is asking for. So sometimes I was regulated because I had the capacity to meet the moment's demands. I had the time and the energy. And you could see that I was very dysregulated other times. I remember one night when my husband came up from the downstairs level of our house while I was ranting at the kids in the kitchen at supper time, and he just looked at me and said, "Go upstairs to your room. Don't come out for the night. I'll order pizza." And while a part of me, of course, felt that little twinge of shame, I went to my room and I cried with relief because that's what I needed in that moment. I had zero ability to regulate and I was overcome. So I poured a bath and ate the pizza when it came and watched a show, and he brought the kids in at bedtime for quick hugs, and otherwise my responsibilities were gone for the evening. If I had had access to the tools, I might have had options for how to regulate even more, but I didn't know good parenting tools existed. There was little choice for me. I wasn't aware of and couldn't access what I needed to help me make different choices. So it's not just regulation, but that we may not know the tools exist or have access to emotional regulation strategies, even to learn them, that could help us make different or better choices. And regulation is also affected by what we're going to talk about next. The other influence of choice, something else that was causing rage in my parenting, was trauma. What we don't realize about trauma is that the damaging part of it is not usually the initial event, like my parents' divorce, but the shame or the emotional burden or the twisted reasoning that we take on afterward. The loneliness we take on because suddenly we can't share ourselves completely because something has gone wrong in our world. With my parents' divorce, a fear entered me that someone who loves you can one day just be gone. They'll leave, and you'll never know why, and never be able to do anything about it. And I also felt that arguing and yelling and conflict was intolerable, and I had to prevent that at all costs. So, with this fear of abandonment and of conflict ruling me, I now had to learn to be perfect and to be quiet so I wouldn't cause anyone to be angry with me or to leave me. Years later, when I was working to heal some of this stuff, my inner wisdom naturally showed me that I had made the choice to shut down my feelings, to stop talking in order to be safe. So we're talking about a different kind of choice here, and here is where we need to be really delicate. Because did I really choose that? I was only 7 years old. How can a 7-year-old know what she's doing? There were no tools and no guidance, and I had no actual thinking awareness of what I was doing. I just had this subconscious response to the trauma of divorce. So it was still a choice, but it was a subconscious one. And the thing is, we can't fault people for the unconscious choices they make, for the things they divert to when they don't have tools or awareness or the emotional or mental development to know better. But when the time comes that they do have the support and tools and awareness, then more responsibility comes in, more ability to respond to whatever is going on under the surface. For a long time, my life was governed by the subconscious choices that 7-year-old girl made. In fact, her choice to not feel what was going on inside her and to not ask for anything from others and to avoid conflict and her fear of abandonment and her trying to be perfect was so much of what was causing my rage in later years. And I couldn't figure out what was wrong because I couldn't feel what was going on inside. She had shut down her feelings. Once I had the right environment to heal, and it was the right time, and I was ready, and I wanted change, and I could see the choice that little girl made, now I could choose to actively work on healing. Then, when I started to behave out of the wounded parts of me, that part that was trying to be perfect, that would avoid conflict, that would stop her feelings from being felt, etc., I could notice it and say, oh, that's me acting out of an old pattern. There's pain here. There's a need here. I can pay attention to this now, the way I'm feeling it right now, so that it doesn't have to control me. And over time, as I practiced that more and more ability to make a different choice came my way. I was more aware of what's going on, so I could notice it sooner and make different choices. In episode 19 of this podcast, titled Are We Bad or Good?, I mentioned Dr. Richard Swartz and his work on the theory of internal family systems. This idea that we all have a bunch of different parts inside of us that act separately from or together with other parts, and all these parts are influencing each other, just like a family living in the same household does. So I had a wounded part in me, a part that believed she was unlovable, or she wouldn't have been abandoned. Then there were protective parts that started acting on her behalf so she wouldn't have to feel that feeling again. Fear came in to keep her safe. There was a part that cut her off from feeling things so she wouldn't have to notice in every moment how unlovable she was and how hard everything was. There was a critical part that came in to judge her by giving her a critical voice inside herself so that she'd keep trying to be perfect so people wouldn't be angry with her and leave. And then rage, like a firefighter who comes in to hose down everything when the house is on fire. Rage was the explosive end resort that would reset everything and make me go back to trying to be perfect and good the next day. And I wasn't aware of any of these pieces, and I couldn't prevent them from acting. The next time you see yourself or another person acting in a way that seems beyond rational thinking or behavior, or when their adult behavior looks like what's more appropriate to a daycare than a mature 40-year-old or 60-year-old, just ask yourself what might be going on inside them. What wounded parts might be taking control, steering the whole thing? Because most assuredly, something is controlling them. They have fallen into patterns of drama, of putting people down, of internet trolling, or yelling, or whining, or making demands. There are other protective parts, too, that are less publicly dramatic, but sometimes dramatic just the same. Collapsing, depression, eating disorders, anxiety, overwhelm. These are just unhealed parts, unmet needs rising to the surface. I know because I've been there. I've felt out of control. I've raged and felt shock and shame afterwards. I've also collapsed, gone inside myself, binged food, withdrawn, felt numb. Some people, their parts help them feel more righteous and right and in charge, like they've got it all under control and they take pride in it, but then they can't let go of control even when it's appropriate to do so. So that's also wounded parts coming together as a team to work in a delicate way to keep the ecosystem inside them from collapsing in pain and disorder. And as we grow awareness, we don't want to stay in those places. And when we revert to them, we can try to notice what's going on by giving that part loving attention, going below the surface of our skin to learn more. There's a lot more that could go into this episode. The point I'm trying to make is that even for extreme harmful behaviors, at some level, a person is being subconsciously controlled by wounded parts or a lack of awareness of what's happening. And this is always influenced by the different parts that come together to make up how we express ourselves, who we are born as, plus our DNA, and environment and upbringing and painful events, and then the things we are challenged by even as we become adults. When we know this, it can free us from judging others and ourselves, because we understand that our behavior is in service to something we may not even be aware of or understand, a wound or a need. And saying something like, we all have choice, they should have acted better, and then feeling that people should have consequences and punishments for choices they make that maybe were beyond their control, is really a cop-out. It's a way to keep things tidy, to stay uninvolved, to let other people take care of the mess, of the difficulty, to surrender people to the legal system and the powers that be. It's to say on some level, I don't understand, and I'm not interested in understanding or helping. Truthfully, human beings are messy. It is never black and white. By saying, you chose to do that, we don't have to ask how to better support or serve that person. But if we understand that there are more shades of gray, more nuance to it than the black and white extreme, we can start to learn how to support people early in life. We can start to change our social programs to preventative and educational instead of responsive after the fact. We can eliminate punishment. We can spread emotional tools and strategies and language. We can work to be a healing presence to every person around us so that we are healing the world one little act at a time. Instead of blaming people for addiction and crime and staying on our high horse, we can understand that they are being controlled by protective parts, which ignites our compassion, because we all have protective parts that act out and sometimes control us, even if they aren't as extreme as for other people. When we understand we are all the same, influenced by and reacting to the same things, we can start to really connect, really listen, and help each other heal. Humanity is messy, and the only way we make it better is by taking our messy selves into the mess and reaching out one hand at a time to someone else in their mess. Underneath it all, what's really needed is not less mess, but more connection. As you consider what we've been talking about in this episode, I know the concepts of choice and behavior and responsibility are difficult and messy, by which I mean it's not clean cut. There's no one way to navigate all of this stuff. So just know that we are human. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to unconsciously act out sometimes, act out of our own unhealed parts or our pain. We cannot be perfect. And all we can do in that time is learn to manage the shame of it by reaching out for empathy, and then look for advice and support if we're really stuck and really not liking what we're doing, how we're showing up, or if it's harming others. And we can try to grow and do better. But we will never be perfectly regulated, perfectly acting human beings. That is an impossible standard. But we can find grace and connection and find that being with people is better than being perfect. We can learn to repair relationship when we've acted in a way that is hurtful. We can offer empathy to others, and we can talk about the hard stuff so we feel less alone on the journey. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. If something about this episode has triggered another thought for you, or you want to make a comment, I'd love to hear your feedback. You can always comment on YouTube, you can do it on Spotify sometimes, and you can also send me a DM on Instagram at Sacred Self Guide. I'd love to hear about this episode or anything else you'd like to talk about in the future. And stay tuned for next week when we go a little deeper again.